Today's daf is daf pei aleph. Amar Yudam Rav lo shanu ela be'ir. The Mishnah allows two men to be alone with one woman, and Rav limits it to the city. Avol baderech, but if they're on the road, achiu shlosha, we need three men with one woman in order to be matir. Shema yitztarech echad mem lahashtin. If one of them has to go to urinate, and he's marchik himself, he goes away from his friends, nimsa she'echad misyachin ima erva, and then he'll be left alone with a woman. So therefore, if we have an extra man, meaning three men, even if one of them goes out, nevertheless, there's still two men with a woman. Name him a we have a support text from a Mishnah for Rav. Most from lo shnei talmidei chachamim in Sota. After the Kini and Stira, and now he takes his wife up to the Beis Hamikdash, then they should be accompanied by two Talmidei Chachamim Shem Yavo Le Baderech. And the halacha is that if he has beer with her before the Hashka, that passes the Hashka. And therefore we want to guarantee that he wouldn't have beer with her. And the Gemara is Medayik. Trey V'iu, there are two Talmidei Chachamim plus him. Hatlasa, all told, you have three men. And the Gemara rejects it. Hasam, there with regard to Sota, the reason why we need two Talmidei Chacham is not because we're afraid that he'll have relations with her, but rather ki hechi d'nehevi alei sahadi, that if an event he does have a relationship with her, there'll be two witnesses who'll testify in front of Beis Din, Shebal Ishto, that he had a relationship, and therefore they're not going to waste mechikas Shem Shamayim Levatola and be mashkaha when the hashka is not worth a dime because he had a relation with her. But it doesn't mean that the two Talmidei Chachamim are there because of the yichud to prevent yichud. And it could be that as far as preventing yichud is concerned, one Talmid Chacham would be enough because then it's two men with one woman. Rav Rabbi Yehuda v'Ka'azla v'Urcha, they were on the road. There was a woman that was walking in front of them. Amalei Rav Rabbi Yehuda, Dal Karech, speed up your movements and Mekane Gehenim so that we get in front of her, because if we remain behind her, we might come to some sort of an Avera and we'll fall into Gehenim. Amalei Rabbi Yehuda returns to Rav and he says, V'amar hu d'yamar b'kshem shaper dami. Rav was of the opinion that two men with one woman is okay, and we're not worried about a possible nichshal, a possible maisabiyah. So why do we have to run ahead of her? Rav responded, when I said that one man is allowed to be alone with two men are allowed to be alone with one woman, and these two men are ksherim, maybe what I had in mind is not ksherim like you and me, but rather kigon Rabbi Chanina bar Papi v'chaverav. And the chaverim of Rabbi Chanina bar Papi are none other than Rabbi Tzadok and Rav Kahana, about whom the Gemara tells us back on Daf Lamed Tes Amud Beis that Rabbi Chanina bar Papa, when an Isha tried to seduce him for znus, he Amar Lachash, he made some sort of a lachash, an expression, and called Gufin Ismaili B'Shchin, and therefore he was saved from the Avera. And the Gemara tells us about a woman who came to be Tovea Rav Tzadok to an Avera, and he went into an oven. The Gemara tells us about Rav Kana, that Tavasu Ishal Avera, and he jumped from a roof, and Eliyahu Hanavi saved him on the way down. Those are the ksherim that I had in mind. Amar Rav, Malkin al hayichud. If a person violates the Isa D'Rabbanan of Yichud, then he gets Makas Mardas. The Ein Osen al Yichud. But we're not going to say that an Eish who had Yichud with another man is therefore Asur L'Baila, because the Isa L'Baila only applies to a Sota that had Kinui and Stira. Here there may have been Yichud, which is Stira, but not Kinui. So therefore, we're going to assume that she didn't have beer with that man, despite the fact that they had yichud. Amar of Ashi lo Amaron. When do we say that we were allowed to give malchus? to someone who violates the Yichud El B'Yichud in Pnuya. Aval B'Yichud in Eishes Ish, we're not going to allow for Malchus if a man violated the Yichud with Eishes Ish. Why? Because people will think that the reason why we're beating him up and giving him lashes is because they had a Ma'aseh Bia, and Kadesh Lo Teitze Tehei Motzi Las Al Paneh. People say that the children of this woman are Mamzerim, and therefore we won't implement lashes. Mar Zutra Malki, Mar Zutra nevertheless argued against Rav Ashi and disagreed with him. He gave Malchus to an Eishes Ish who had yichud with another man. And in order to solve the problem that they shouldn't be motzi las al panei machriz, he would make a statement that we're only meeting out Malchus because she violated Isa yichud, but not because we know or we believe that she had snus. Amalei Rav Nachman mi partoya le Rav Ashi mar nami lilke v'lichris. Why, Rav Ashi, are you so afraid and hesitant to meet out Malchus? Why not just make this achroza? Amalei, Rav Ashi responds, Ika de Shama Baha, v'lo Shama Baha. There'll be people who heard about the Malchus, but they didn't hear the achroza. Not everybody will hear the achroza, and they'll suspect that she had bia, and therefore they'll be motzi lav al baneh. Amar Rav, Malkin alotova shmua. If a person is suspect to have averis nus, he has a very bad reputation. People are saying about him, the motzi shmua, that he violates averis, then we give him malchus, shenemar, because we have a violation of an isur, as formulated here in Shmuel Aleph Perik Beis, when Eliah Cohen gave tochacha to his sons because they had a Shmuel Lotova, because they kept the Yoldos overnight in Shiloh, and he said to him, Al Banai, Al is a lashon of a lav, ki Lotova Shmua. So Al Bani or Banai indicates an Isa that they violated because they have Maisim that generated a Shmuel Lotova. And for that, they deserve Malchus. Mar Zutra, the Gemara tells us about Mar Zutra that when he gave out Malchus to someone who had a bad reputation, Mosifla Afsira al Kasfe, he would put a saddle of an animal on the shoulder of the person who got Malchus, Mikri lay, and he would be Makri the Pasuk as he gave Malchus Kel Banai. And that way he was Modia, he was publicizing the fact that the violation of this lav of Al Banai is the reason why he's giving out Malchus. So what's the story here with the Afsar Shal Behem Al Kotef Al Loke? Hatam Mishum Shebazeh Chosmin Es HaBehema She'asaker Rayim Shelo Torutz V'Tistem and Adera. This saddle is where they tie down the reins and they make sure that the animal does not misbehave and go off the road. So Mar Zutra wanted to give a remez that a person should not be sotem in adera. Amar Rabba, we go back to the laws of yichud. Baila be'ir ein choshev mishum yichud. Amar Rav Yosef Pesach Basul Shram ein choshev mishum yichud. These are two situations in which there's no chashash yichud. One is baila be'ir. Her husband is somewhere in the city, within the city limits, and the poskim don't make any differentiation how large of a city, how long of a city is, what a metropolis it is, and so forth and so forth. However, the poskim want to say that this only applies where the husband could possibly find them, meaning she's having a yichud relationship in the house. But somewhere in a private place in the city where the husband would not even have a clue where to find her and to show up and surprise her, then there's no mirsas. And Rashi points out this is all based on mirsas, meaning that a woman is not inclined towards having a maises nus. If she has mirsas, she's afraid that maybe her husband will come and find her. Also, with the Pesach Pasul Shusarabim, at any moment somebody might come through the Pesach and discover them and that creates a certain harta'ah, a certain inhibition, and it removes the Isa Yichud. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach is famous for saying that there's a fundamental difference between these two Heterim. In the first case, there is Yichud. He's alone with the Seishes Ish in a house. Just the Chachamim were matir because they said there's no Chashash Nus. In the second case, however, there's no Yichud at all because the Pesach is Pasuch L'Shus Rav, it's not a private place. Rav Bibi Ikla Lebei Rav Yosef. Rav Bibi came upon the house of Rav Yosef, Basar de Karch Rifta, and it was after they ate upstairs in the Aliyah, they ate bread. Now, Rav Yosef, together with his wife, go down to the house. Amalahu, Rav Yosef says to the Anshe Beso, Shkuli Dargami Tuse Bibi. Take away the ladder that is underneath Rav Bibi. In other words, that would connect the Aliyah where they ate to the bias. Because Rav Bibi might come down from the Aliyah through this ladder, and he'll be Mesiachid with my wife, the wife of Rav Yosef. So the Gemara immediately asked for Marava Vaila Be'ir and Choshev Mishum Yichud. There wouldn't be an Isa Yichud because of Yosef, even if he's blind, the poskim say, but nevertheless he's in the city. Shiny Rav Bibi, we have a special chumrah with regard to Rav Bibi in this particular scenario. The Shushvine say Havi v'Gaisebe. We have a principle called Libo Gaspa, and literally Shushvinisa means Balas Bris, which means that he has a relationship with this woman, in this case, the wife of Rav Yosef. An ongoing relationship. Maybe she was raised with him, maybe they're relatives, or perhaps they have business connections, and that's called Libo Gaspa. We have to be extremely machmir in Libo Gaspa, and we're not going to be matir Baila Be'ir. And what ensues here is a discussion in the poskim about Pesach Pasuch L'Shus Rabim. Do we have to be machmir in Libo Gaspa? Or should we say, as we said before, in the name of Shlomo Zalman, that in the case of Pesach Pasuch L'Shus Rabim, there's no yichud at all? Rav Kahana said, what happens if you have two rooms, and the men are in one room, and the women in another room? And these two rooms connect to each other. Anoshim b'chutz, if the men are in the outer room, the women in the inner room, ein choshev mishum yichud. There's no chash of yichud, because if one of the men would go inside to the inner chamber and be mesiachid with the women, so it's not really something that we normally anticipate that a man would go inside. In other words, when a person leaves a room, we're not afraid that he goes into an inner chamber. We usually generally assume he's going to go through the outer chamber. And if, on the other hand, a woman who's in the inner chamber would want to go out, and now she's going into the outer chamber where the men is, there also is no chashash, because we said that a woman is allowed to be alone with two men. However, if the men are in the inner chamber, they're in the outer chamber. Why? Because maybe one of the men wants to go outside. He will leave his inner chamber where he's located, go to the outer chamber. And when he goes derech the outer chamber, then that's where the women are, and he might be mesiachid with women. However, the Gemara tells us that despite Rav Kahana's ruling, b'masnisa and a brisa, tanifcha, we have the exact opposite. And when the men are in the outer chamber and the women in the middle chamber, then we are chosh mishum yichud, because maybe one of the men will go into the cheder pnimi and he'll have yichud with the women, and his friends won't know about it. But if the men are in the inner chamber and the women on the outer chamber, then we're not chosh mishum yichud, because if one of the women would go into the inner chamber with men, then she's alone with more than two men. And even if one of the men will go outside to the chitzoni, to the outer chamber where the women are, he has to be afraid that other men might come out and they'll find him. So therefore he's afraid to sin, he's embarrassed. Now that we have Rav Kahana, we have the opposite in the brisa, is we're going to be machmir in both cases, And we're going to say that if the men are in the outer chamber, the women in the inner chamber, or even if the men are in the inner chamber, the women are in the outer chamber, it's us. Abaye Dayer Gulfe. Abaye, when he saw that the men and the women were together at a chuppah or at a drasha, he would organize kankanim bicheres. He would set up these kinds of flasks that were made of china, and set up like a kind of a mechitza that would separate between the men and the women. Rava, Dayer Kana. Rava used to set up rows and rows of beams that separated between the men and the women. And all this is to avoid that the men shouldn't go into the women or vice versa. Amar Alvin, Sakva Deshata Rigla. The regel means the holiday, has a weak point to it. Why? Because that's when men and women get together to come and hear, the official drasha. They mix together, they speak with each other, and they look at each other, and they make eyes at each other. The Gemara tells the following story. Hanach Shvuyasa di Asoy. There were these gorgeous women who were captured, and they were brought to Narda. Askinu Lebei Rav Amram Chasida. They brought them up to the Aliyas Gag, to the roof top of Rav Amram Chasida. Vashkulu Darga Mikamaya. And they took the ladder away when these women were up on the Aliyah, so that the men would not climb up the Aliyah and have yichud with the women. When one of these captive women passed by through the opening to the Aliyah, Nafal Nahura Bi'ifuma, a very strong light fell into that Pesach to the Aliyah. Apparently, she was so beautiful, this woman, that she radiated a certain light. And Shakli Rav Amram L'darga Delohavi Yachlin Be'asar L'midli. Rav Amram himself was overwhelmed by the Yetzer Hara because of the beauty of this woman, and he lifted up a ladder that was so heavy that it would normally take 10 people to move the ladder, and he was able to move it himself, Dalil Chudeh, because he had such a cheshek and a desire, burning desire of taiva, that he had all of a sudden the energy of 10 men. Solikli Azil, he starts climbing up the ladder in order to get to that beautiful shvuya and sin with her. And kimata lepalgi darga, once he got halfway up the ladder, he grabbed hold of himself, ifsach, and he stopped, frozen in his tracks. What did he do? Ramakola, Nura Be'amra. He starts screaming, there's a fire in the house of Amram. So that people from the entire neighborhood would come to put out the fire, and he'd be so embarrassed that he'd be able to overcome his Yetzer Hara and not violate the Avera. Also, Rabbanan heard him scream, fire. They came and they saw there was no pit. They understood that he was doing this to save himself from the Yetzer Hara. Amrulei, kasfitin, you embarrassed us. I mean, people are going to say that Talmidei Chacham are overcome by such a taiva. Amalahu, mutav techaisvu be'amra didain, heidain, below techasvu minai b'alma diyosi. Better that we be embarrassed in this world than the Aver is done, it will be embarrassed in the next world. Ashbe, Rav Amram was mashbia his Yetzer Hara, the yin pak minei, that he should go out of his body. Nafik minei, the Yetzer Hara went out because in Lekovid Rav Amram's shvur. Ki amud denura, and he looked like an amud, a pillar of fire. Amar le, Rav Amram says to Yetzer Hara, chazi diat nura. Look, you're a pillar of fire. I'm not bisram flesh. Fire should normally consume flesh. V'ana difnamina. And yet I am greater than you because I overwhelmed you and I was victorious. And even though normally the Aish would burn the boss. Rabbi Meir having mislot says the over Avera. When Rabbi Meir found out about people who were so overwhelmed by taiva and desire that they succumbed to the Yetzer Hara, he laughed at them. Like, can't you overcome the Yetzer Hara? Yom Echad, one day, in Malay Satan Kisasa, the Satan appeared like a woman. Bahach Gisa Dinara, on the other side of the river. And Rabbi Meir notices a woman on the other side of the river. Lohavi Mavra, there was no way of getting across. There was no boat. Nakat Mitzvah V'Ka'ava. Rabbi Meir held on to a rope, and it was stretched over the river from one side to the other, and he began to pull on the rope in order to get to this woman, or the Satan that looked like a woman. Ki Mata Palgav Mitzvah, when he got halfway through the river, Shavke, the Yetzer Hara let go of him, and he no longer had that type for the Avera. Omar, the Satan says to Rabbi Meir, Ilavdaka Machruze Berakia, Hizaru Rabbi Meir, Vitoraso. If not for the fact that you had Achroza, they announced in the Shamayim that you better les up it, leave Rabbi Meir and his Torah, I wouldn't have left you. Vishavise Lidomach Tarti Moi, you would be worth 2 mos of Kesef, meaning I would be Matzliach to machshel you in an Avera. Unbelievable Gemara. That Rabbi Meir would be machshel because of his taiva. He would go across a river with a chevel. That's the power of the Yetzer Hara. Now this reminds you of the famous statement of Chazal Enim Hakshafas Harayis. Rabbi Kiva, same story happened with Rabbi Kiva. He was making fun of those who succumbed to the taiva of the Yetzer. And Yom Achade, Idmulei Satak, his Sabreish Dikla. The Satan appeared in the form of a woman. She was on top of a dekel tree. Naktele Dikla, Rabbi Akiva took the dekel and Kosolik v'Osif, and he started climbing up to the top of the dekel in order to do an aver with this woman. Kimatal Palgi Dikla, when he got halfway up the tree, Shavke the Yetzer Hara left him. Omar turns to Rabbi Akiva and says, he loved him. He zaru Rabbi Akiva Toraso, Shavsi the Damach Tarti Moy, I would make you into someone who's worth 2 mos of Kesef. Plima Avi Karagil Meimer Kol Yoma. Plima would curse the Yetzer Hara on a daily basis. Gira Biene de Satan. Let the chitzim, the arrows, go through the eyes of the Satan to be mavatal the Satan. And the Satan got very, very upset and very insulted by this curse of Plima. Yom Echad, so what did the Satan do? On one fine day, the Maili Yom de Kippur, it was Erev Yom Kippur, and Idmi Le Ke'anya. And the Satan appeared like a poor person. Asa Karabava, and he starts banging on the door, and he's requesting a handout. Afikule Rifta, they brought out from the bayis a pas lechem 50. Amalei, the Satan says, Yomaki Idna, on this holy day of Erev Yom Kippur, Kuli Alma Kavoy, everybody's eating on the inside of the house, Vanoa Broy, and I get lift outside, I have to find myself a park bench to eat on, Island. So they invited the Ani, who's really the Satan, to come inside the house with Krivile Rifta, and they gave him bread to eat inside the house, but they didn't let him sit together with the family. Amalei, the Satan says to Plimo, Yoma Kia in on this holy day of every Yom Kippur, Kuliyama Ataka, everyone's sitting at a table, Vanolu Chudoy, and I'm left as a Galmud all alone. I see you. Viosvinu Ataka. They brought him in and they let him sit at the table together with the Bnei Avais. Now the Satan pulls out his tricks. Havi Yosef, the Satan is sitting at the table. Mile nafshe shichna v'kive aleh. He made his body full of shchin, of injuries and blisters, full of pus. It was mamish disgusting. Not only that, he started doing things ma'usim. The Mefarshim say that he started plucking away at his boils, and the whole family was like just completely shocked by the disgusting appearance of this so-called ani. Amrule. So the Bnei Abayis said to the Satan,